Good morning. Today we are going to start off our election special week with a presentation on voting rights and voting qualifications in the state of Ohio. Okay, guys, we have a presidential election and just a general election next Tuesday, and so it's a pretty big deal. Okay, so we want to talk about voting rights and the history of voting rights and the qualifications. Okay, so the first question is, what is voting? When you vote, it means that you express your views in response to some kind of poll. Okay, so we know what voting is when we're voting for the representative that we want to represent us in our government, okay? Or we're voting on issues that we want to pass or we want to not pass. So let's go over just some history of voting in the United States, okay? In 1776, only white male property owners were allowed to vote. Those are the only people that were allowed to vote. They decided everything. White male property owners. In 1848, there was actually the first women's suffrage conference. So that is the women, like a woman's right to vote, in Seneca Falls, New York. Some pretty popular and important, influential women's suffrage champions: Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, along with 60 men and 32 other women, signed something called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. And what this does is it calls for equal voting rights for women. Okay, but again, this is only pertaining to white women at this point. In 1870, after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment is passed, which prohibits the government from banning voters based on color, race, or any previous condition of servitude, which means if they were previously a slave. So this made it legal for African Americans to vote. However, in 1889, southern states began instituting a poll tax. So they would literally charge people to vote. This was a tactic they used to prohibit African Americans from voting, because African Americans at this point, a lot of them did not have much money, okay? So they charged them, and so really the only people that were able to vote were people that were rich, which tended to be the whiter people, okay? In 1920, finally, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is ratified, and it is officially legal for all women to vote, okay? In 1964, okay, this is when the 24th Amendment banned those poll taxes. So from 1889 to 1964, poll taxes were legal. It was legal to charge people to vote, okay, which is crazy for us to think about, how you have to pay to perform your civic duty. I mean, hello, what? In 1964, a very important year for voting and just civil rights in general, the Civil Rights Act was passed. This banned any kind of discrimination based on race, national origin, religion, gender, anything like that. So this included voting practices, but it was more of like a law that ended discrimination as a whole, or banned it from government practice or public practice, okay? In 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. This, again, prohibits racial discrimination in voting practices. So we have all these amendments and acts that had to be passed because people were still finding ways to discriminate against people and stop them from voting based on their race. This act was extended in 2006 for another 25 years, okay? In 1971, we have the 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It was ratified, and it actually lowered the voting age to 18. Prior to this, it was 21. But in 1971, we had something called the draft, where people were being drafted into the military, okay? And they were saying, hey, if I can fight in a war at 18, shouldn't I also be able to vote? And I think a lot of people agreed, and in 1971, we passed that 26th Amendment to lower that voting age to 18. The slogan was always old enough to fight, old enough to vote. And then in 1993, the National Registration of Voters Act was passed, and it actually allowed for mail-in voter registration and to just make voter registration available at a lot of different government offices. So this made it easier for people to register, which got more people voting, okay? All right, let's talk about voting qualifications. We are going to talk about just Ohio since that's where we live, all right? So the voting qualifications in Ohio are the following. You must be 18 years old, okay? There are some cases, if it's a primary election, they will, so that's like the election right before a presidential election where the different parties are voting on their candidate. They will let 17-year-olds vote on a provisional ballot if they are going to be 18 by the general election. You also must be a U.S. citizen, okay? You must be a citizen of Ohio for 30 plus days before the election in order to vote in an Ohio election, and you must be registered, okay? You will also need to show some kind of proof when you get to the poll, or if you get an absentee ballot. So you'd have to have an ID of some sort, whether it be a driver's license or an identification card, or there's other qualifying documents, okay? Today, go ahead and do your show it. If the following people email me and say, hey, Mrs. Nugent, I heard my name in your presentation, your entire class will get a positive bonus point. It's going to be Haley A. from 3rd period and Prashan B. from 7th period. If you guys email me, your whole class will get a bonus point. Please let me know if you have any questions.